Hello, and thank you for joining me again for part 1.3 of this series. At this stage, I have already given an overview of the experience that set me on this journey, and in this section, I will begin the first part of a much deeper analysis of this experience. This section in particular will be a relatively short one, in which I will describe the overarching quality of the experience, and will serve largely as a prelude to the following section, in which I will discuss my interpretation of the experience in some depth. So without any further ado, I will begin where I left off in the previous section with the specific thought that triggered my mind into this experience. This idea was a simple one. It was the idea that the concept of true nothingness cannot mean anything because that which does not exist cannot be described. That what we mean when we use the term nothing is precisely just the absence of things, and that everything other than an existing thing should be contained within this nothing. In particular, what should be included in a concept of nothing which can be described is the infinite array of things that could exist but do not actually exist, which is to say, nothing is potential. Now, this was purely an idea and not one that I necessarily believed or believe today, but it was probably the first idea that wasn't strictly physicalistic or nihilistic that I had ever allowed my mind to form. As it turned out, all it would take was this single idea to dismantle all of those I'd had before it. And as this thought grew to dominate my awareness, my perception of time seemed to shift in some way. It felt as though time had become more solid and complete, as though the past and future were pushing into my awareness and into the present moment. And then I became aware of other dualities, of being and non-being, of good and evil, all fused together at the present moment. It was like my awareness was travelling down a tunnel with one half of some fundamental duality on either side of me, and it felt like the world was being generated at every moment between the halves of these dualities. The key quality of the experience was therefore this quality of complementarity, of two distinct yet interdependent constructs who rely on each other for their own existence and whose interrelation is responsible for the phenomena of causality, of evolution, and of the manifestation of the actual from the potential. This complementary relation was not composed of specific forms, but rather represented two styles or modes of activity which simultaneously opposed and completed each other. It is, therefore, exceedingly difficult to provide an exact description of what these complementary forces are, and this is something that I struggled with for some time. What was clear, though, was that one aspect of this complementarity was expressive of that which is known, and the other that which is not. One was obvious, and the other was obscure. This may well be connected to the fact that the past, as that which we know, and future, as that which we don't, was a particularly conspicuous example of this complementary relation. What was also clear was that these forms are real structures in consciousness, almost like its source and its drain, but they are usually hidden beneath the deafening chatter of thought and the obfuscating constructions of belief and opinion. These constructions had momentarily been dismantled, and this had allowed me to perceive the basic and natural form of the present moment beneath it. Each of these structures gave off a very distinct feeling to which my mind drew all sorts of associations from ordinary experience. It felt like they represented two different ways of living, and the distinction between optimism and pessimism are two concepts that my mind always seems to resort to when thinking about the experience. After some time, I began to recognize them as forms of intelligence, and I now refer to the first, which consciousness is bursting out of, as meaning, and the second, which consciousness is fading into, as memory, though for a long time I referred to this second form as reason, and I will explain why shortly. So, by the term memory, I mean a couple of different things. First, it is simply the manner by which experience is recorded in a physical sense. It is a discretely encoded record of reality. It is that which we learn, which we can recall, which we can write down and formulate. And so memory is indeed related to our notion of the past. Secondly, it is a mechanistic understanding of reality, its creation, and the causal processes contained within it. In this sense, memory relates to our ever-evolving collective understanding of the world through empirical science. It is a pragmatical and logical architecture through which we come to rationalize our world, and this is why I've tended to refer to memory more simply as reason, the totality of the reasoning capacity of humanity. This is because I do not mean by memory as simply that which we remember, but rather as all of that which we can remember. It is the answer to the fundamental how question, how does existence exist, and confers a final, rational description of our world. By the term meaning, on the other hand, I refer to the basic conditions that allow reality to exist and persist in the first place, regardless of the mechanisms through which this occurs. Meaning is the answer to the fundamental why question, why does existence exist, and is a much more difficult entity to pin down. To boot, meaning is distinctly indescribable, for any attempted description of it becomes a part of memory and reason, and so no longer meaning at all. Meaning is also a self-referential term because it relies on itself for its own description, and this is partly why it cannot be discretely and rationally explained in any finite amount of time. Meaning relates to our notion of the future, for it is always something that is beyond our grasp, and any time we do gain a glimpse of it, it becomes something else entirely. And now, this next part was the most distinct facet of the experience. I was aware of the evolution of meaning in response to the evolution of memory, and the evolution of memory in response to the evolution of meaning, and this is something that I visualized incredibly clearly. It was almost as though meaning and memory were imbalanced weights on either side of a scale, and as additional weight was added to one side to counteract the other, the scale went out of balance on the opposing side. An additional weight would then be required for the second side, and then one for the first, and then one for the second, and on infinitely. As each weight was added, the relative difference between the total weights grew smaller, and the two sides came more into balance. But perfect balance was never reached, and as I will attempt to explain in the next section, this is due to the integral structures of each of these complementary forms. This struggle for balance expressed an autonomous and self-perpetuating means of creation, and it was from this struggle and disequilibrium that my own awareness was being generated. Meaning and memory thus appeared to persist in the contradictory condition of necessarily being in balance, yet fundamentally unable to be so, and it was from this paradoxical state that existence was exploding into being. In other words, the meaning why existence exists, or why any phenomenal entity arises at all, must, yet cannot, perfectly correlate with the reason how it exists, and this is, as far as I can tell, the fundamental truth underlying the notion of all causality. Meaning and memory in its final form of reason must be in balance because ultimately they are a single thing, expressing itself in two different ways. They are both the ultimate truth, if you will. But they also cannot be in balance, and the reason for this will be the topic of the following section. The important thing to take away from this section, though, is that it is this interrelationship between meaning and memory which gives rise to the phenomenal world. All things are generated anew within this eternal now purely as a consequence of the inequality between them, and because the only way to keep meaning and memory aligned is through more and more complexity, we get the distinct feeling of time and change and the evolution of our world. But this too is merely a consequence of this fundamental struggle for balance. This is, therefore, to say, our entire existence is a means of compensation for the inequality generated by the structure of the meaning and memory relation. We don't need to involve anything mystical or magical into this image. All that I realized was that the interdependence between the why and the how is also interdependent with the is. In summary, then, my experience was an experience of complementarity. It was a recognition that the interrelation between two seemingly opposing structures that cannot arise independently provide an explanation for the creation of all systems, including that of existence itself. These complementary structures are inversely related to one another, and they complete, create and provide the ground for each other. They resonate themselves into being by virtue of their own interdependence and the feedback loop that they generate between them. This phenomenon of complementarity is a central focus of my work, and their expression as meaning and reason is just one example of the ways in which they manifest themselves throughout every aspect of our world. Now, I appreciate that much of this may make little sense to you at this stage, but the sole purpose of my work is to try and make it make sense. It is unfortunate that I am required to complicate the experience in order to explain it, because in truth it was not complicated in the slightest. On the contrary, the experience was the epitome of simplicity. It was the simplest and clearest experience I have ever had. It was so simple that it's almost beyond words. But this juxtaposition between simplicity and complexity was actually part of the underlying quality and feeling of the experience. It was a feeling of humour, a pure, gracious and reassuring irony arising from the inexpressible simplicity and the imperceivable obviousness of the nature of causality. I still find myself chuckling at this humour now and again, even after all this time. The spirit of joviality that we know so well when we spend time together is consistent to the core reality. There is meaning to the meaningless, and in this we should find some reassurance. I can only assume that I cannot aptly portray this experience for the same reason that one cannot explain why a joke is funny. Our existence is the ultimate celestial pun, but it's not a joke because it's senseless. It's a joke because it's meant to be fun.